Hi guys, my name is Brenna Johnston, and my presentation for this week is on Chapter 8 of Johnston's Radical Behaviorism for ABA Practitioners. This chapter is titled Ethics, Rights, and Values Without the Heat, and covers ethics and ethical communities, and rights versus values, what they are and where they originate, along with the associated religious behavior. Johnston begins by introducing a board-certified behavior analyst by the name of Tobin, who mainly worked with the agency personnel who ran programs for people with intellectual disabilities. Tobin expresses concern regarding how one of the agency's day programs operates. He says that the day program has many activities that they put on, but there seemed to be no rotation of activities, and the clients would remain in the same activities year after year. This concerned him because other clients would likely benefit from these activities, but never had the opportunity because the same person or persons would be at that activity each year. When he questioned the behavior specialists about this, he or she said that the clients were able to choose where they wanted to work and freely chose their long-standing placements. Now, this initiates a discussion on ethics because choice was something that his department promoted as a value and fully stood behind, as they would incorporate it in policies and provide value-centered training amongst all agency personnel. Clearly, Tobin didn't agree with this, but to speak up would mean he would be instantly looked down upon, and it was too difficult a fight to fight alone on the matter. He knows he could talk the behavior specialist into approaching it in a more behavior analytic way, but the issue was so widespread that in order to make a real change, the entire culture of values within the intellectual disabilities culture would have to be addressed. This brings me to the first section, ethics and ethical communities. We know that ethics are the moral principles that govern a person's behavior, but how do we develop these morals? Johnston explains that ethics are a result of the contingencies sanctioned by a community. In most communities, it is especially valued to treat elders with respect, and our behavior towards the matter is likely to be met with consequences that either strengthen or weaken that behavior. If someone were to disrespect an elderly person, they might get yelled at, which would likely make the person feel shame or humility and alter their future behavior when dealing with elderly persons. It is important to know that contingencies are what define ethical values and not the values that drive the contingencies. Ethical standards come about as a result of social contingencies. These standards can be rules that were deemed appropriate or inappropriate by the community, or they can be governmental laws. They can be formal or informal. But whichever they may be, they usually reference how we behave towards one another. Ethical standards may also have indirect effects on the population. One might commit a crime, and in witnessing that crime, it would lead to aversive behaviors from others and overall social disapproval. And the communities I keep mentioning that create the ethics are appropriately termed ethical communities, and these consist of those who share participation in contingencies that reinforce or punish certain behavioral practices. In the next section of the chapter, Johnston covers rights, and it's important to know that rights are just verbal behavior as they have no physical status. We're always stating our rights or saying we have the right to do this or the right to do that, but what exactly are rights? According to Johnston, when referring to our rights, we're describing circumstances that allow one to obtain reinforcement or avoid punishment. We're also insisting that we control access to these contingencies and that others should obtain our permission if they wish to act in a way that involves such contingencies. One example of a right to utilize and control our own body And a major violation of this would be if someone were to commit the act of rape. Obviously. Rights statements are commands that describe what others should do for that person, stating their rights. This basically suggests that the speaker's conditions are deprived or they're experiencing aversive stimulation, and the stated consequences are what would resolve such conditions and become reinforcing. The example provided here is one could state that they have the right to enjoy the movie without others texting on their phones, meaning that such aversive activities not be engaged in. If they're successful, the right statement is maintained by the reinforcing consequences, enjoying the movie without disruption. Johnston notes that it is important to understand that our rights should not be viewed as superior to others, and that any right statement can be matched by a contrary statement. One right always bumps into another in some way or form. For example, having the right to bear arms conflicts with people's right to stay safe from harm, or parents' disciplinary rights conflicts with children's rights of safety from abuse. And I would like to refer back to ethical communities, as this is where rights statements originate. And it is within these communities that we develop our verbal repertoire and our verbal behavior regarding rights. It is also how we grow to understand our rights. As we learn from the contingencies within our ethical communities, it is also within these communities that we develop a sort of limit of rights. Like, we have the right to use our possessions, such as our cars, but ethical community that is defined by governmental interests limits these rights by enforcing limits as to how fast we drive, where we can drive, or how loud we can play our music. The next section tackles values and how they compare to rights. Just like rights, values are verbal behaviors rather than physical entities and refer to morally accepted or desired behaviors within a community that originate and are shaped by that community or ethical community. They're similar in a behavior analytic perspective because they're both verbal behavior about our behavior and the behavior of others, and specify consequences for behaving in certain ways. Johnston states that though we raise distinctions between rights and values, the distinctions are not consistent. However, rights may just specify the associated reinforcers more clearly, while the circumstances associated with values are evident without specification. Are values beyond science? It is a popular argument that values are beyond science, and science cannot resolve questions about what is good or bad or what we should or ought to do. Approaching these values as verbal behavior, however, would counter that claim. First of all, by saying should or ought implies that they're reinforcers or punishers. If I were to tell my roommate that she ought to wear a coat, that would imply that there is a reinforcing consequence for doing so, which would be staying warm. By translating values into behavioral terms, we can pursue scientific questions in regard to behavior. In the instance of having to make the difficult decision to pull the plug when a loved one is on their deathbed, we're faced with conflicting values such as personal choice and sanctity of life. Reinforcement history could lead to decision between the two values, and observation of other cultures may help determine which decision is just. It is such a difficult argument to tackle because cultures have very differing views on values, and cultural values are always changing, though changes never happen fast enough for those pushing for it. Today's America is the perfect example of that. Not only is our country divided in regard to values, but changes occur too slowly to people's liking, and changes that are made simply just can't appease everyone. In regard to religious behavior, such behavior deemed religious may simply be operant behavior that is learned from our verbal communities. Behaviors like going to church, praying, singing hymns, etc. Johnston explains that how we view the topic, whether or not we believe in God, it's a result of our own operant behavior originating from our reinforcement history. He clearly states his view on the topic when he explains that some of us will continue participating in religious life, even though they understand that such behavior is what it is. He compares it to talking to our dog as if he or she understands us and telling our family members we love them dearly. Johnston concludes the chapter with a section titled "Taking the Heat Out of Arguments," and I believe this section to be particularly important because it discusses the heated debates that arise from differing views regarding rights and values, such as the differing views I spoke about earlier. In taking a behavioral approach, though not easy, the key to having a successful conversation without emotional overtones is in getting all participants to agree that value statements are learned verbal behavior. By doing so, it becomes easier to focus on objective evidence and to consider other courses of action. This can be achieved by focusing on the circumstances under which each participant's verbal behavior was learned, so you can get an idea of what influenced their values. And that concludes my presentation. But before I go, I'd like to ask you guys a couple discussion questions on the chapter. First, I'd like to know, do you believe what Johnston says to be true regarding rights and values originating from contingencies and reinforcement within our own ethical communities? Feel free to discuss your take on what he says regarding religious behavior, but don't feel like you have to. Also, have you had differing views regarding rights and values, whether personal or in general, from your own friends? What were they and how did you resolve the issue? Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to hearing your responses.